I've always had a strange connection with my imagination. As a kid, my daydreams and imagination were so lifelike that they kept me entertained most days, whether or not that was a good thing. My dreams weren't any different. Some nights I'd have incredibly detailed dreams that were stunning to experience. However, I learned pretty early on that having an imagination this vivid came at a cost. The terrifying dreams and visions started when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I'd see visions of beings I thought were angels appearing in doorways, holding me in my dreams and showing me strange things. Like most people back home, I grew up in a very religious home. You'd think that this would be comforting, but they always terrified me. The angels I saw had no faces, and when they held me, their embrace was ice cold. I found no comfort in them, to be honest. And that's probably one reason I drifted away from religion so early in my life. I can't fully remember all the things they showed me in my dreams, but I know they weren't always scary, just deeply unsettling at the very least. As I got older, the visions, though some were still gentle, turned increasingly terrifying. Sometimes after a horrible dream, I'd call out for my parents like any kid would, and one of them would have to come in. Usually they'd sit beside my bed, stroke my hair, give me a kiss and go back to their room, but on some nights, I'd feel even more scared when my parents, or what I thought were my parents, came to comfort me. Because at times they'd only peek around the doorway and stare at me. My room would be nearly pitch dark. Maybe if I was lucky, a bit of moonlight slipping in. And I could just make out the shape of a head. There were no features visible, just a pale outline. I'd call out Mum or Dad a few times, but they'd never answer. Whenever this happened, I remember wondering, hey, why does Mum or Dad look taller tonight? But as a young child, I never questioned whether it could be something other than my parents coming in to check on me when I was, scared. Eventually I'd say, I'd tell them they're frightening me, and after that unbearably long silence, the head would retreat back into the hallway. Now, looking back, I know for certain that those were not my parents. As time passed, I became more aware of these tall figures. I began seeing them like this around the age of 8, but by age 9, the experiences had worsened. I remember being in year 4 and going to one of the toilets at school. After I finished up, I went to the sink to wash my hands. Now, the sinks faced the stalls, so looking in the mirror, I could see them clearly. As I glanced down at my hands, working the soap in, I caught a glimpse in the mirror of a head peeking over the stall I just left. It had a typical classic men's haircut, but what struck me was that I should have been able to see eyes, or at least eyebrows, but there was nothing there. I froze. Even now, 15 or so years later, that image is burned into my mind. It was completely motionless. I desperately hoped it was just my imagination. There were no sounds from it I could hear, no breathing, no shuffling, nothing. After I snapped out of the initial shock, I turned around hoping it had vanished, but no. Still there. Now I couldn't even pretend that it was just the mirror playing tricks on me. Even with no eyes, I could feel it watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually its head slowly sank down out of view. When it was gone, I looked at the bottom of the stall and saw its shoes. Plain, brown, businesslike ones. As soon as I noticed that, I heard something. It started fumbling with the door. Looking back now, it seemed like maybe it didn't know how doors worked. The thought of facing it directly overrode all other feelings, and I bolted. And just as I ran out, I heard the stall door creak open. That day marked the beginning of my personal nightmare. These things appeared more frequently after that. A week after the first sighting, I was in class during a history lesson. I heard the faint, slow clack, clack, clack of shoes, like a teacher walking down the corridor. I didn't pay much attention as it was a, familiar sound, but then I realized the last step sounded right outside our room. I turned toward the doorway, and when I did, I jumped out of my seat, stumbling back against the wall, unable to do anything but scream. It was there again. The same tall figure as in the bathroom stall, only this time I could see the whole body except for the head, which was way too high for the doorway. It wore a smart suit, the kind you'd see in a solicitor's office or a lawyer. The hands, though, were grotesquely misshapen, with stubby fingers and fleshy, malformed palms. Everyone in the room looked at me, then turned towards the door, and as you'd expect, they just looked back at me with confusion and I think a little fear. My teacher rushed over, trying to figure out what was happening, but I couldn't look away. It felt like if I blinked, it would just grab me and I'd be gone forever. After what felt like a minute, while I was still crying uncontrollably, the figure moved for the first time. And normally its movement would have looked funny, but this was terrifying. It didn't turn around like a person would, but took one long, exaggerated sidestep out of view. Imagine that as you will, but I'm not going to try to describe how unnatural it looked. My parents were called, I went home. It took hours for them to get anything out of me, but eventually I told them. They took me to a child psychiatrist. They knew I'd had frightening visions occasionally, but seeing me so shaken that day was the last straw. The psychiatrist chalked it up to an overactive imagination and explained that childhood hallucinations weren't unusual and would fade in time. He told my parents to return if it continued happening frequently. The visions of the tall ones didn't stop, and soon I was on medication. As you can tell, I probably wouldn't be telling you this story if the meds worked, but the meds did nothing to help. After a while, I started seeing these tall people other than the businessmen. This went on for years, and years of enduring it wore me down. But you know what, eventually I thought I was managing better. I won't sit here and describe every encounter, but I'll share the one that landed me in the hospital. So I was about 13, I was outside at recess, trying my best to socialize and play some soccer with the other kids. At some point I looked across the oval towards a nearby street and saw a flash of red moving between two houses. I immediately felt on edge. None of these tall things had ever moved that fast. I tried to ignore it and get back to the game, but a while later, I looked over again and froze. Just like when I was 9. There across the street stood an incredibly tall woman in a red dress. Maybe around 10 feet tall. I did my best to stay calm, using techniques I'd learned to keep myself grounded and present and to control my breathing. But when I glanced back, it started to take those slow, exaggerated strides towards me. Then, without warning, it broke into a sprint. It was like watching its bones dislocate with every step. I can't even describe it fully. I screamed, and I ran as fast as I could, racing into the school to find help. Oddly enough, I couldn't find anyone. The building seemed empty. Then, I heard the door I'd entered slam open, followed by loud, hurried footsteps. I knew it was the tall woman, and for the first time I heard it make a noise. A muffled yet still horrific scream. As if someone was screaming into a pillow. And believe me when I tell you, it did not sound human at all. Something about that sound made me give up. It filled me with an overwhelming dread that just stopped me in my tracks. I heard the footsteps drawing closer, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. And I'd kind of already accepted my fate. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. The police said I was hysterical, lashing out at anyone who tried to approach me. When I told them what I'd seen, they explained that I'd never actually gone into the school, that everything happened out on the oval. I had cuts on my arms and on my back, though no one was sure how they got there. They thought I might have done it to myself somehow. So, long story short, I spent months in the psych ward. Lucky for me, the tall ones disappeared after that. Though the feeling they left never really went away. A part of me always wondered if there was something real about them. I'm writing this now because 10 years later, yesterday, I found myself in a work bathroom stall. I'd gone to take a break and scroll on my phone when I heard the bathroom door creak open, slowly. That's when I got goosebumps. The hair on my back and my arms stood up. Those familiar, all too familiar, slow footsteps echoed in. The cold, icy chill running through me. I'd know those footsteps anywhere. And then, those all too familiar brown shoes stopped right in front of my stall.